The file opens with a low hum, as if the archive itself is exhaling a secret long denied. The cover page describes a place the Nazis called escape-proof, a fortress of stone, steel, and humiliation. Colditz Castle, officially Oflag Fosse, a prison for the most determined Allied escape artists. Inside its medieval walls, watched by guards armed with submachine guns and microphones concealed in rafters, a handful of prisoners would spend months building a flying machine that should never have existed. A two-man glider, concealed in an attic above the chapel, crafted from bed slats, powdered milk, piano wire, and stolen fabric. In a war defined by tanks, bombers, and collapsing cities, this was the story of men who chose flight not as combat, but as defiance. To understand their audacity, one must first return to the battlefield chaos that shaped them. Soldiers stumble across shattered earth, exhausted and fearful, eyes lowered against gunfire. These were the men Germany singled out as dangerous, not for violence, but for their ability to escape. Officers who had fled from other camps, pilots who had slipped through enemy lines, naval officers who had survived sinking ships. Their reputations earned them a place in Colditz, a fortress meant to break their will. The tanks advancing through Europe in the early years of the war created a tide of surrender and capture. Thousands were taken prisoner, but only a few hundred were selected for this particular fortress. Colditz was the final destination for escape attempts the German High Command considered intolerable. The logic was clear. If anyone could embarrass the Reich by vanishing into the night and reaching freedom, it was these men. And so they were placed under the cold stone of a medieval castle built on a cliff above the Mulde River. A place meant to crush imagination. It would instead ignite one of the most remarkable acts of engineering in the entire Second World War. The glider story cannot be understood without the pressure of the broader conflict. The naval disasters across the Atlantic remind us of the stakes, the sinking hulls, the men clinging to rafts, the constant fear of U-boats. Among Colditz's prisoners were naval officers who had survived such horrors, pushed from burning ships into frigid seas, then dragged back into captivity by Austria or Germany. These men understood that captivity was not safety. Captivity was waiting, and waiting was another word for dying slowly. In another frame, fighter planes sweep across a darkening sky. Some of the pilots who ended up in Colditz had been shot down in combat, parachuting into fields before being rounded up by Wehrmacht patrols. They knew speed, they knew lift and drag, and in the stillness of captivity they remembered the principles of flight better than the guards realized. The file moves into images of shattered cities. The ruins of Warsaw, Rotterdam, and London echo the daily reality of war. A world collapsing under bombardment. Under such destruction, the prisoners at Colditz watched from their medieval windows as Germany first expanded across Europe and then slowly began its long retreat under Allied pressure. Every rumor, every distant explosion, every change in guard behavior hinted at shifts in the front line. The prisoners were trapped in stone, but they plotted futures beyond its walls. Among the Allied troops landing on beaches later in the war were men who had once feared Colditz would be their last home. The prisoners followed these invasions closely, listening to forbidden radios, memorizing news that could never be written down. With each Allied advance, escape became not just hope but strategy. If liberators drew near, the castle might become a killing ground. Panicked guards, last-minute executions. The prisoners of Colditz had studied too many Nazi actions to trust their captors' restraint. Civilians fleeing broken towns remind us that captivity is not unique to soldiers. But the Colditz prisoners carried a special burden. They were symbols. Hitler's escape-proof camp was a propaganda tool. No one ever left it, except in chains or coffins. That narrative became a wound to the Allied officers inside. It hardened them. It pushed them to scheme. The radio operators tapping out coded messages reflect the secret lifeline within the castle. The prisoners managed to hide radios in walls and behind false panels. The news these clandestine devices carried was oxygen. They knew when the Allies took North Africa, when the Soviets repelled the German advance at Stalingrad, when Italy surrendered. And from this constant flow of information rose a question. If liberation came suddenly, how could they ensure at least some of them escaped before the SS or Gestapo could intervene? The glider became their answer. Nurses tending wounded soldiers evoke another dimension of the story: human vulnerability. While Colditz was an officer's camp and thus permitted Red Cross visits, the prisoners still suffered injuries, malnutrition, and stress. Yet they worked, sometimes for 10 hours a day, on a machine intended never to be discovered. If caught, they would face punishment cells, starvation diets, or worse. Generals studying invasion maps parallel the prisoners observing their own blueprints. The glider, designed by British Lieutenant Tony Rolt and Flight Lieutenant Bill Goldfinch, took shape from memory and intuition. They had no textbooks, no instruments, no aeronautical charts, only scraps of knowledge retained from training and improvisation. They built a secret workshop in the attic above the castle chapel, accessed by a narrow hatch. Here, unseen by guards, they constructed a 20-foot wingspan aircraft from bed slats, floorboards, stolen electrical wiring, and sleeping bags boiled into glue. Images of prisoners behind barbed wire mirror the confinement that inspired such ingenuity. Every day, guards patrolled the courtyard, unaware that above their heads a glider grew inch by inch. Wooden spars, ribs, a fuselage built with symmetry that defied the crude tools available. Fabric stolen from mattresses formed the skin. A flight control system designed from bicycle components emerged with startling sophistication. Propaganda posters speak to Germany's illusion of control. The Reich declared the camp impregnable. Newspapers heralded Colditz as the final cage. Yet even as the posters promised victory, the war turned against Germany. Allied bombers struck deep into the Reich. Submarines prowled the seas. Winter battlefields drained the Wehrmacht's strength. The tide had shifted, and in that shift, the urgency of the glider intensified. Submarines at sea emphasized the global nature of the conflict. Across oceans, men risked everything to break enemy supply lines. But inside Colditz, the glider builders faced their own supply chain crisis. Tools, nails, and cloth had to be acquired without attracting attention. They built hidden compartments in walls. They smuggled wood through false-bottomed carts. They created a pulley system to move long beams unnoticed. Winter soldiers trudging through snow echo the prisoners' own endurance. By late 1944, Colditz shook with the knowledge that Germany was collapsing. Guards whispered. Rations shrank. Tension rose. Escape plans across the camp intensified, but the glider remained the most audacious. It was intended for use only when the war approached the castle, when chaos below might create the distraction needed for a silent launch from the rooftop. Victory celebrations in Europe show the war's closing chapters. But Colditz had not yet been liberated. The glider was complete, fully assembled, its wings sanded smooth, its paint mixed from boot polish. A launching runway of wooden planks lay ready on the rooftop of the chapel. To take flight, the glider would slide down the runway, propelled by a weight system constructed from bathtubs filled with concrete. A simple mechanism: gravity and hope. Berlin's ruins show the cost of the collapsing Reich. As the capital fell under Soviet bombardment, distant Colditz remained a shrinking island of German authority. Yet even here, the prisoners sensed the war's end. They prepared for their moment. The glider team maintained its aircraft, waiting for a signal that the castle's guards were distracted or fleeing. Women in factories connect to the prisoners' craftsmanship. Just as wartime production lines transformed raw materials into weapons, the men of Colditz transformed stolen timber into a flying machine. Their factory was an attic, their machinery, pocket knives and chisels, their labor, invisible. Artillery flashes mark April 1945 when American forces pushed toward the Mulde River. Colditz trembled. Gunfire echoed across the hills. The guards panicked. Some prepared to execute prisoners, others to surrender. The glider team readied the aircraft for launch. This, they thought, was the moment. But it was not. Before they could launch, American soldiers arrived at the castle gates. The prisoners surged forward. Within hours, Colditz was liberated. The glider, still perched in its attic workshop, had never taken flight. It remained a symbol, an unfinished act of defiance, a machine built for a moment that arrived too early. The final image of bombers over a ruined city reminds us how close the world came to destruction. The Colditz glider was not used in combat. It did not carry its pilots to freedom. Yet its creation speaks to a deeper truth of the Second World War, that even in captivity, even in the bleakest circumstances, the human impulse to imagine escape remains unstoppable. This is the legacy of the glider hidden in an attic, a wooden bird built in secret, designed to defy a castle the Nazis believed escape-proof. A reminder that prisons crumble, empires fall, and the desire for freedom endures beyond steel, stone, or war itself.